York City, the Lower East Side, September 1967. The streets here didn't care about your reputation, your background, or your philosophy. They cared about one thing. Could you survive? This wasn't the sanitized New York of tourism brochures and Broadway shows. This was the raw underbelly, where poverty and desperation created a breeding ground for violence, where young men proved themselves with their fists because they had nothing else to prove themselves with, where respect was earned in alleyways and lost in emergency rooms. The neighborhood was a patchwork of ethnic enclaves, Italian blocks bleeding into Puerto Rican territories, Chinese immigrants carving out small sections of safety, Irish families holding on to streets their grandparents had claimed decades earlier. And in the spaces between these territories, in the neutral zones where different worlds collided, that's where the real New York existed. That's where reputations were made and destroyed. Jimmy, the Fist, Callahan, owned these streets in a way that had nothing to do with property deeds or legal ownership. He owned them through fear, through demonstrated capability, through a decade of street fights that had left him undefeated and left his opponents broken. At 28 years old, Jimmy had been fighting since he was 14, not in organized tournaments or sanctioned matches, but in the brutal, no-rules world of street combat, where the only rule was survival and the only prize was reputation. Jimmy stood 6'1", weighed 205 pounds of muscle, hardened by manual labor and street violence. He worked construction during the day, carrying steel beams and swinging sledgehammers, a work that built functional strength, the kind that mattered when you were throwing punches in an alley at 2 a.m. His hands were massive, scarred from countless fights, knuckles that had been broken and healed wrong, fingers that had been bent back and reset without medical attention. His face told the story of his profession, a nose broken 3 times, a scar through his left eyebrow from a bottle that hadn't quite blinded him, a jaw that had been fractured and healed harder. But his eyes, those were what made him truly dangerous, cold, calculating, utterly without fear or hesitation. Jimmy had fought everyone worth fighting in the Lower East Side, Puerto Rican boxers from the gyms on Avenue C, Italian tough guys from the social clubs on Mulberry Street, Irish brawlers from the docks, even a few professional fighters who thought their ring experience would translate to street effectiveness. He'd beaten them all. Not always cleanly, not always quickly, but always decisively. His record, if you could call it that, was 47 wins, 0 losses, 47 men who'd challenged him, or crossed him, or been in the wrong place when Jimmy was in the wrong mood. Some of those 47 had ended up in hospitals. 3 had ended up in morgues, though Jimmy had never been convicted, because witnesses in the Lower East Side had a remarkable tendency to forget what they'd seen. Jimmy's fighting style was pure street evolution, no formal training, no classical technique, just raw aggression and brutal efficiency, learned through trial and error and survival. He'd absorbed elements from everyone he'd fought, taking what worked and discarding what didn't. He could box when boxing was effective, grapple when grappling gave him advantage, fight dirty when dirty fighting was necessary. He'd use weapons if they were available, environmental advantages if they presented themselves, and he had absolutely zero ethical constraints about what constituted fair fighting. There was no fair in the streets. There was only winning and losing, standing and bleeding. The Lower East Side boxing gym on Delancey Street was Jimmy's unofficial headquarters, a grimy third-floor walk-up where serious fighters trained, where neighborhood kids learned to protect themselves, where the old-timers sat around telling stories about fights from decades past. The gym was run by Mickey Chen and a Chinese-American former lightweight who'd had a brief professional career in the 1940s before an eye injury ended his competitive days. Mickey had connections throughout the martial arts world, both Eastern and Western, and he'd been following Bruce Lee's career with great interest. When Mickey learned that Bruce would be in New York for meetings with television producers, he reached out through mutual connections and invited Bruce to visit the gym, maybe give a demonstration, maybe work with some of the neighborhood kids who needed positive influences in their lives. Bruce had agreed, genuinely interested in seeing how fighters trained in this rough part of New York, curious about the street fighting culture that was so different from the martial arts schools and tournaments he usually encountered. Jimmy Callahan was at the gym that Friday afternoon, working the heavy bag with the kind of power that made the chains creak and the ceiling fixtures rattle. Each punch landed with a deep, meaty thud that spoke of genuine knockout power, the kind of force that ended fights quickly and violently. He was shirtless, his torso covered in sweat and scars, a roadmap of every serious fight he'd survived, and there were more scars than clear skin. Mickey approached him carefully. Mickey had known Jimmy since he was 15, had tried to channel his violence into competitive boxing, had failed because Jimmy was too undisciplined for the sport's rules, too violent for sanctioned competition. But they'd maintained a relationship, mutual respect between a man who'd fought in rings and a man who fought in streets. "Jimmy," Mickey started, his voice carrying that careful tone you used with dangerous people. "We're having a visitor this afternoon, martial artist from California, guy named Bruce Lee. He's going to do a demonstration for the kids, maybe show some techniques." Jimmy stopped punching, looking at Mickey with immediate suspicion. "Who is this guy? He's some kind of kung fu teacher. He does martial arts." "Yeah," Mickey confirmed, "but he's different from the traditional guys. He's developed his own system, calls it Jeet Kune Do. I've heard he's incredibly skilled, incredibly fast." Jimmy's laugh was harsh and dismissive. "Mickey, you know how I feel about this kung fu nonsense, all that fancy spinning and jumping and kata bullshit. This is the Lower East Side, not a Hong Kong movie set. Real fighting is about hitting hard and taking hits. All that Eastern mystical crap doesn't work when someone's trying to cave your skull in with a pipe." "I know your perspective," Mickey said carefully, "but I'd appreciate it if you'd be respectful. He's doing this as a favor to me, working with the neighborhood kids for free. Just let him do his demonstration. Don't cause problems." Jimmy returned to his heavy bag, throwing a vicious hook that made the entire mounting structure shake. "I'll be respectful as long as he doesn't try to tell me how fighting works. But if this kung fu master starts talking about how his ancient techniques are superior to street fighting, we're going to have a problem." Bruce arrived at 4 p.m., accompanied only by a local martial arts instructor named Leo Fong, who'd helped arrange the visit. Bruce wore simple black pants and a red Chinese-style shirt, and carrying a small bag with his training equipment. He looked impossibly small and out of place in this rough gym, lean and compact among fighters who'd built their bodies through violence and manual labor. The neighborhood kids were already gathered, about 20 of them aged 12 to 17, mostly Chinese and Puerto Rican, kids from families struggling to survive in one of New York's toughest neighborhoods. They looked at Bruce with curiosity mixed with skepticism. They'd grown up around street fighters, around men like Jimmy Callahan. This small man from California didn't look like he could survive 5 minutes on their streets. Mickey made introductions, and Bruce began his demonstration by explaining Jeet Kune Do's philosophy, the idea of taking what worked from different martial arts, discarding what didn't, and constantly evolving rather than preserving tradition. He showed basic techniques, demonstrated the 1-inch punch on a volunteer, explained principles of economy of motion and simultaneous defense and attack. The kids were engaged, clearly impressed by Bruce's speed and precision, asking questions, volunteering to participate, and Jimmy Callahan watched from the corner, his arms crossed, his expression growing darker with each passing minute. After about 30 minutes of demonstration, Jimmy pushed off from the wall where he'd been leaning and walked toward the center of the gym. His presence immediately shifted the atmosphere, the kids quieting down, everyone recognizing that something was about to happen. Mickey saw Jimmy approaching and moved to intercept him. "Jimmy, don't. Whatever you're thinking, don't do it." Jimmy ignored him, walking until he was standing at the edge of the demonstration area, maybe 10 feet from where Bruce stood. Bruce stopped mid-explanation, turning to look at this large, scarred man radiating hostility. "You're Bruce Lee," Jimmy said. It wasn't a question. His voice carried that particular quality of someone used to being heard and obeyed, with an edge of threat underneath. Bruce nodded. "I am. And you are?" "Jimmy Callahan. People around here call me the Fist. Maybe you've heard of me." Bruce's expression remained neutral, polite. "I haven't, no. But I'm pleased to meet you." Jimmy's smile was cold and humorless. "You've been standing here for half an hour telling these kids about fighting, about technique, about your Jeet Kune Do philosophy, teaching them like you're some kind of expert." Bruce chose his words carefully. "I'm sharing what I've learned, what I've developed, different approaches for different contexts. I'm not claiming my way is the only way or the best way for every situation." "That's real diplomatic," Jimmy said, his voice getting louder now, drawing the attention of everyone in the gym. "Real careful with your words. But let me tell you something about fighting. Something these kids need to hear. Real fighting, the kind that happens on these streets, isn't about technique or philosophy or economy of motion. It's about who hits harder, who can take more damage, who wants it more. It's about violence, pure and simple. And all your kung fu demonstrations and your fancy theories, they don't mean shit when someone's trying to kill you in an alley." The gym had gone completely silent. The kids looked scared, recognizing the pre-violence tension and the atmosphere that preceded Jimmy's street fights. Leo Fong moved closer to Bruce, ready to intervene, but Bruce gave him a subtle gesture to stay back. "You're absolutely right about some of that," Bruce said calmly. "Street fighting is different from tournament fighting or demonstration. The psychological element, the willingness to hurt and be hurt, those matter tremendously. And I respect your experience in that context." But Jimmy wasn't listening to conciliation or respect. He was already committed to this confrontation, his pride and his reputation demanding it. "These kids look up to me," he continued, stepping closer. "They know I've fought for real, that I've survived things that would break normal people. And then you show up from Hollywood with your philosophy and your demonstrations against cooperative partners, and suddenly They're supposed to think that's real fighting. That's dangerous, man. That's going to get them hurt. I'm not teaching them to fight in the streets, Bruce replied, his voice still calm, but with an edge now. I'm teaching them discipline, control, self-defense principles. Different from what you do. Not better or worse, just different. Now Jimmy was only 6 feet away, well within striking distance, and his body language had shifted from challenging to predatory. Different, he repeated mockingly. That's another careful word. You want to know what I think? I think you're afraid to say what you really mean. I think you believe your martial arts are superior to street fighting, but you're too smart to say it directly. So, you hide behind diplomatic language and philosophy. Bruce's expression remained neutral. But those who knew him would recognize the focused intensity in his eyes, the subtle shift in his weight distribution, the preparation for conflict. I'm not afraid of you, Bruce said quietly, but I'm also not interested in fighting you just to prove something. These kids don't need to see violence for entertainment. They see enough of that already. Jimmy's laugh was sharp and cruel. Afraid or not, that's exactly what I'm offering. You and me, right here, right now. No demonstrations, no cooperative partners, no philosophy, just real fighting. Let's see if your Jeet Kune Do works when someone's actually trying to hurt you. Mickey Chen stepped forward, his voice urgent. Jimmy, this is my gym. I'm asking you, as a friend, don't do this. Bruce is a guest. He's here helping the kids. There's no reason for this. Jimmy turned to look at Mickey, and his expression softened slightly. Mickey, I respect you. You know I do. But this guy's teaching these kids things that could get them killed. Someone needs to show them what real fighting looks like. And if he's too scared to accept my challenge, that proves my point just as clearly as beating him would. I'll accept your challenge, Bruce said, and the gym erupted in shocked exclamations. But I want these kids to leave first. They don't need to witness this. They can stay, Jimmy countered. They need to see this. They need to learn what happens when theory meets reality. Fine, Bruce agreed. What are the rules? Jimmy's smile widened, genuine pleasure showing through now. No rules. That's how street fighting works. No referee, no time limit, no illegal techniques. We fight until someone can't continue. Mickey tried one more time. This is insane. Jimmy, he's half your size. Bruce, you don't need to prove anything. Let's just end this now before someone gets seriously hurt. But both men ignored him. They were already committed, already past the point where words could de-escalate the situation. The gym cleared a space in the center, fighters and kids forming a rough circle, everyone understanding they were about to witness something significant. Liu Fong pulled Mickey aside. Is Bruce going to be okay? This guy looks like he's killed people. Mickey's face was grim. I don't know. Jimmy's the real deal, as dangerous as they come. I've seen him put professional fighters in the hospital, but I've also heard stories about Bruce, things that sound impossible. I guess we're about to find out which reputation is real and which is Hollywood myth. Jimmy removed his shirt, revealing his scarred torso, making sure Bruce and everyone else could see the roadmap of violence his body had endured and survived. He cracked his neck, rolled his shoulders, his hands forming fists that looked like sledgehammers. I'm going to enjoy this, he said to Bruce. I've wanted to teach you Hollywood kung fu guys a lesson for years. You've been going around making movies, doing demonstrations, collecting students, and money, while real fighters like me are actually putting our lives on the line. Time to show everyone what real violence looks like. Bruce stood relaxed, hands at his sides, no guard position, looking almost casual. To Jimmy, this looked like either supreme arrogance or complete ignorance of the danger he faced. "Come on then, little man," Jimmy taunted. "Show me this Jeet Kune Do. I'd show me how your philosophy holds up when someone's actually trying to break you." Bruce's response was quiet, almost gentle. "When you're ready, begin." Jimmy launched himself forward with frightening speed for a man his size, closing the distance between them in 2 explosive steps, his right fist already cocking back for a devastating haymaker punch that had knocked out dozens of opponents over the years. His fist swung forward with brutal power, aimed at Bruce's head, the kind of punch that would absolutely end the fight if it landed, that would probably require hospitalization. But it didn't land. Bruce moved, and what happened next occurred so quickly that most of the witnesses couldn't fully process it in real time. As Jimmy's haymaker came forward, Bruce shifted his entire body slightly to the left, and slipping inside the arc of the punch by perhaps 3 inches, and simultaneously his right hand shot upward, striking Jimmy's extended arm at the inside of the elbow joint. The strike wasn't hard, wasn't powered, was barely more than a touch, but it was precisely placed, hitting the exact point where the ulnar nerve was most exposed, and the effect was immediate and shocking. Jimmy's entire right arm went dead, the nervous impulse controlling his muscles interrupted, his fist opening involuntarily, his arm dropping to his side, useless and numb. Before Jimmy could process what had happened, before his brain could even register the neural disruption, Bruce's left hand struck forward, a short, sharp strike to Jimmy's solar plexus. With that same focused energy transfer he'd demonstrated countless times before. The impact was precise and devastating. Jimmy's forward momentum, combined with Bruce's strike, created a force that his body simply wasn't prepared to absorb. His diaphragm seized, his breathing stopped, his legs suddenly lost all strength, and the expression on his face went from aggressive confidence to absolute shock in the span of a microsecond. He stumbled backward 2 steps, his left hand clutching his midsection, his right arm still hanging useless at his side, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, trying desperately to draw breath, but finding his respiratory system completely unresponsive. Then his knees gave out, and Jimmy, the Fist, Callahan, undefeated street fighter, the most dangerous man in the Lower East Side, went down to his knees on the gym floor. The entire sequence, from Jimmy's initial punch to his collapse, took 5 seconds, maybe less. The gym exploded in chaos, kids shouting in amazement, fighters staring in disbelief, everyone trying to comprehend what they'd just witnessed, because this wasn't supposed to be possible. Jimmy Callahan didn't lose. Jimmy Callahan had beaten professional fighters, had survived knife fights, had put men in hospitals and morgues, and this small man from California had just dropped him in 5 seconds without breaking a sweat. If you're watching this story and you're learning something completely new about Bruce Lee, if this is showing you the reality behind the legend, I need you to hit that subscribe button right now, because there are dozens more true stories like this, documented accounts that prove Bruce Lee wasn't just a movie star. He was the real deal. And Jimmy was on his hands and knees now, still unable to breathe, his face turning red, panic starting to show in his eyes as his body refused to obey his commands. His right arm was beginning to regain sensation painful tingles replacing the numbness, but his diaphragm was still frozen. Bruce knelt down beside him, his voice calm and instructional. Breathe slowly. Try to relax. Your diaphragm is in spasm from the strike. It will pass in about 20 to 30 seconds. Fighting the panic will only make it worse. Jimmy's eyes locked onto Bruce's face, and the expression there was no longer hostile or aggressive. It was fear, pure and primal, the fear of someone who suddenly couldn't perform the most basic function of survival, who couldn't draw breath, who thought they might be dying. "Please," Jimmy gasped out, barely audible. The word came out broken, desperate. "Please, I can't breathe." "You can," Bruce said firmly. "Your nervous system is rebooting. Stay calm. It's already passing." And it was. After another 15 seconds, Jimmy managed to draw a shallow, gasping breath, then another, deeper. His diaphragm was slowly remembering how to function, his autonomic nervous system recovering from the disruption. Color was returning to his face, though the shock and fear were still clearly visible. The gym was absolutely silent now. Everyone watching this legendary street fighter on his hands and knees, begging, struggling to breathe, defeated so thoroughly and so quickly that it challenged everything they understood about fighting, about toughness, about who was truly dangerous. And if you're enjoying this story, if you're fascinated by what really happened when Bruce Lee faced real fighters, hit that like button. It helps more people discover the truth. Jimmy slowly pushed himself up to a sitting position, still breathing hard, still clutching his solar plexus with his left hand, his right arm functioning normally now, but clearly shaken by the experience of having it shut down so completely. He looked up at Bruce with completely new eyes. "What did you do to me?" His voice was hoarse, stripped of all its earlier aggression and confidence. "I intercepted your attack and countered with 2 strikes," Bruce explained, his tone purely educational. "The first strike hit your ulnar nerve at the elbow, temporarily disrupting the neural pathway controlling your arm. The second strike targeted your celiac plexus, causing your diaphragm to contract involuntarily. Your nervous system interpreted both as major threats and shut down non-essential functions to protect itself." Jimmy stared at him, trying to process this explanation. "I've been in hundreds of fights. I've taken punches that broke ribs, kicks that should have crippled me. How did you shut down my entire body with what looked like light touches? Because I wasn't trying to overpower you," Bruce said. "I was targeting your nervous system, your body's control mechanisms, your muscle mass, your toughness, your pain tolerance. None of that matters when I'm not attacking your muscles. I'm attacking the signals that control your muscles." One of the fighters in the crowd, a heavyweight named Carlos Mendez, who'd sparred with Jimmy multiple times, spoke up. "But Jimmy threw that punch so fast. Sam, how did you even see it coming? Much less counter it?" "I didn't react to the punch," Bruce explained, standing up and offering his hand to Jimmy. "I read the signals that preceded the punch. His shoulder telegraphed that a haymaker was coming. His weight shift confirmed it. His hip rotation told me the timing. By the time his fist started moving, I was already responding to the intention, not the action." Jimmy took Bruce's hand and let himself be pulled to his feet. He stood there, still unsteady, still processing what had happened to him, what it meant for his self-image, for his reputation, for everything he'd built his identity on. "I came here thinking I'd teach you a lesson," Jimmy said quietly. "Thought I'd show these kids that street fighting beats fancy martial arts. Instead, you just He paused, struggling with the words. You just made me feel helpless. Like all my experience, all my fights, all my toughness meant nothing. Your experience matters, Bruce said firmly. Your toughness is real. But you've been fighting people who fight the same way you do, who use the same strategies, who make the same assumptions about what fighting means. What I showed you isn't superior to street fighting. It's just different, optimized for different principles. Jimmy shook his head slowly. Man, I couldn't breathe. I've been stabbed. I've been hit with bottles and chains. I've fought through broken bones. But when I couldn't breathe, when my body just stopped working, that was the most scared I've ever been in my life. That's why I studied the human body so carefully, Bruce explained. Not to cause maximum damage, but to understand maximum efficiency. Pain can be endured. Damage can be absorbed if you're tough enough. But neural disruption, that bypasses toughness entirely. Mickey Chen had approached now, his face showing a relief that this hadn't ended with someone being hospitalized or killed. He put a hand on Jimmy's shoulder. You okay, Jimmy? Jimmy nodded slowly, then looked at Bruce. I owe you an apology. I came at you with disrespect, tried to embarrass you in front of these kids, challenged you to prove I was superior. You had every right to seriously hurt me, and you didn't. You controlled the situation, made your point, but you didn't try to humiliate me. Bruce's expression was kind. You challenged me because you care about these kids, because you wanted to protect them from what you thought was bad information. That's not something to apologize for. The motivation was good, even if the approach was confrontational. The kids had pressed closer now, amazed by what they'd witnessed. Their perception of fighting completely transformed. One of them, a 15-year-old Puerto Rican kid named Miguel, spoke up. Mr. Lee, how do we learn to do that? How do we get that fast, that precise? Years of training, Bruce replied. Thousands of hours of practice. But more importantly, you need to understand why you're training. Are you training to defend yourselves, to compete, to develop discipline? Different goals require different approaches. Jimmy looked at the kids, then back at Bruce. These kids, most of them are training because they need to survive on these streets. They need practical skills that work when someone's coming at them with bad intentions. Can what you teach help with that? Absolutely, Bruce said. Self-defense isn't about winning fights. It's about avoiding fights when possible, ending them quickly when necessary, and surviving. What I teach emphasizes efficiency, awareness, controlling distance, intercepting attacks before they fully develop. All of that applies to street situations. Jimmy was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with something. Then he spoke, and his voice carried genuine humility. Would you be willing to teach me? I've spent 10 years thinking I understood fighting, that my street experience made me an expert. You just proved I've been operating with incomplete knowledge. If you're willing to teach, I'm willing to learn. Before I answer that, Bruce said, I want to know something. Why do you fight? What drives the violence? Jimmy's face hardened, all pain showing through. I grew up in Hell's Kitchen, a worse neighborhood than this one. My father was a drunk who beat my mother and my sisters. When I was 14, I tried to stop him, and he put me in the hospital. Fractured skull, broken ribs, internal bleeding. While I was recovering, I promised myself I'd never be helpless again, never let anyone hurt me or mine. So I learned to fight, learned to be harder and meaner than anyone else, became the most dangerous man on these streets, so nobody would ever try me again. Bruce nodded slowly, understanding. That's a powerful motivation, and it's made you formidable. But it's also trapped you. You've become defined by violence, by the need to prove you're the hardest, the meanest, the most dangerous. That's a prison of its own. What if I could teach you to be just as effective, but without the need to constantly prove it? To be secure in your abilities without having to demonstrate them through confrontation. Jimmy's eyes showed something vulnerable now, something beneath the hardened street fighter exterior. Is that possible? After so many years of being this way, it's possible if you're willing to do the harder work, Bruce said. Physical training is easy compared to the mental and emotional work of changing how you relate to violence, how you understand strength, how you define yourself. But yes, it's absolutely possible. If you've made it this far in this story, I want to ask you something. Leave a comment below telling me what you think about Jimmy's transformation, about Bruce's approach to someone who challenged him with genuine hostility. I read every comment, and I want to know what resonates with you. The demonstration for the kids continued, but with a completely different energy now. Jimmy participated, asking questions, volunteering to help demonstrate techniques, his earlier hostility completely gone, replaced by genuine curiosity and respect. Bruce showed the kids basic self-defense principles, emphasizing awareness and de-escalation before physical technique, explaining that the best fight was one you never had to fight. He demonstrated simple, effective techniques for common street situations, escaping grabs, defending against haymaker punches, protecting yourself against multiple attackers. And through it all, he emphasized control and precision over aggression and power. The kids absorbed everything, asking intelligent questions. Their earlier skepticism transformed into engaged learning. They'd seen proof that what Bruce taught actually worked, that his small frame and philosophical approach could overcome Jimmy Callahan's size and street-proven violence. That was more convincing than any demonstration against a cooperative partner could ever be. After the session ended, after the kids had left with promises to practice what they'd learned, Jimmy sat with Bruce and Mickey in Mickey's small office above the gym. "You know what the crazy thing is?" Jimmy said, and he was smiling now, a genuine smile without the cruel edge. "I've been in hundreds of street fights. I've won them all, built my whole identity on being unbeatable, and getting beaten by you in 5 seconds, it's like someone lifted a weight I didn't know I was carrying." Mickey raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Jimmy struggled to articulate it. "All these years, I've had to be the hardest, the meanest, the most dangerous. Every day, every interaction, I had to maintain that reputation because my safety depended on it. If people stopped fearing me, stopped believing I was unbeatable, I'd become a target. But now," he gestured at Bruce, "this guy just proved I'm not unbeatable. And instead of feeling threatened or diminished, I feel relieved, like maybe I don't have to carry that burden anymore." "That's because you confused reputation with security," Bruce said gently. "You thought being known as unbeatable was what kept you safe. But real security comes from competence, not reputation. From actually having the skills to defend yourself, not from making everyone believe you have them. Reputation requires constant maintenance, constant demonstration. Competence is just there when you need it." Jimmy nodded slowly. "So what you're saying is, I've been fighting all these years, not because I had to, but because I thought I had to maintain an image." "Partially," Bruce confirmed. Some fights were necessary, I'm sure, but how many were really about protecting yourself or others, and how many were about proving you were still the most dangerous man on the block? Jimmy thought about it for a long moment. Honestly, maybe 1 in 10 was actually necessary. The rest were about reputation, about showing people they couldn't challenge me. That's exhausting, Bruce observed, and it's a game you can't win long term. Eventually, someone younger, hungrier, more desperate will come along. Or you'll get older, slower, injured. If your security is based on being unbeatable, then the first loss destroys everything. But if your security is based on competence, on actually understanding fighting at a deep level, then one loss is just information, just a lesson, just an opportunity to improve. Before we finish, I need to ask one more favor. If this story gave you a new perspective on Bruce Lee, on street fighting, on what real martial arts mastery looks like, please share this video. Send it to someone who needs to see it, who's trapped in the same cycle of violence and reputation that Jimmy was stuck in. Sharing helps spread these lessons to people who need them. Jimmy Callahan became one of Bruce Lee's most dedicated students over the next several years. He would travel to California 3 or 4 times a year for intensive training sessions, and Bruce would work with him when visiting New York. Jimmy's fighting style evolved dramatically. He retained his street-hardened toughness and his understanding of real violence, but he integrated Bruce's principles of efficiency, timing, and precision. More importantly, his relationship with violence changed. He stopped needing to prove he was the most dangerous man in the neighborhood. His reputation actually grew after his defeat by Bruce, not despite it, but because of how he responded to it. Word spread through the Lower East Side that Jimmy Callahan had been beaten in 5 seconds by a martial artist from California, and instead of making excuses or seeking revenge, Jimmy had acknowledged his defeat and become the martial artist's student. That took a different kind of strength, a different kind of courage than street fighting required. The kids at Mickey's gym saw a new model of masculinity in Jimmy after that day. Not just the hardened, tough guy who solved everything with violence, but someone who could acknowledge limitations, who could learn, who could evolve. Several of them started training seriously in martial arts, and Jimmy mentored them, passing on both his street wisdom and the principles Bruce had taught him. Years later, after Bruce's death in 1973, Jimmy was interviewed for a local newspaper article about the impact of martial arts on neighborhood youth programs. The interviewer asked him about the famous fight with Bruce Lee. Jimmy's answer became one of the most quoted testimonials about who Bruce really was. "I challenged Bruce Lee, thinking I was the toughest man he'd ever face, thinking my street experience and my perfect record made me invincible. In 5 seconds, he proved I understood maybe 10% of what real fighting meant. He could have seriously hurt me. He could have humiliated me in front of those kids. Instead, he taught me the most important lesson I ever learned, that real strength isn't about dominating others, it's about mastering yourself. He beat me in 5 seconds, but the lesson took years to fully understand. Best 5 seconds of my life, even though I spent most of it begging to breathe." The article included a photograph of Jimmy teaching at Mickey's gym, now in his 40s, but still powerful, demonstrating technique to a group of neighborhood kids with the same patience and precision Bruce had shown. The gym's walls were covered with photographs, and prominent among them was a picture of Bruce Lee, signed, "To Jimmy." the student who taught me that even the hardest men can be humble. Keep evolving. I'm Bruce. Jimmy kept that photograph until his death in 1998, and in his will, he donated it to Mickey's Gym with instructions that it remain on display as a reminder to every fighter who walked through those doors that toughness without wisdom was incomplete, that strength without control was dangerous, that the hardest lesson any fighter learns is when to stop fighting. The Lower East Side changed over the decades, gentrification replacing some of the desperate poverty, new immigrant groups replacing old ones, but Mickey's Gym remained, still serving neighborhood kids, still teaching both boxing and martial arts, still emphasizing Bruce Lee's principle that real martial arts was about self-development, not just self-defense. And every instructor who taught there, every fighter who trained there, knew the story of September 1967, on when Jimmy the Fist Callahan, the most dangerous street fighter in the neighborhood, challenged a small martial artist from California and ended up on his knees in 5 seconds, begging to breathe, and began the real education that would define the rest of his life. 5 seconds that showed the difference between fighting and understanding fighting. 5 seconds that proved reputation meant nothing against competence. 5 seconds that demonstrated you could win every street fight and still be operating with incomplete knowledge. 5 seconds that changed one man's life and influenced hundreds of others who heard the story and understood its lesson. Bruce Lee weighed 140 pounds. Jimmy Callahan weighed 205 pounds and had never lost a fight in 10 years of street violence. By every conventional measure, Jimmy should have destroyed him. But in 5 seconds, Bruce proved that fighting has dimensions most street fighters never explore, that precision and knowledge can overcome size and experience, that the most dangerous opponent isn't the one with the most wins, but the one who understands combat at a level you've never encountered. Jimmy came to that gym planning to beat a martial artist and show neighborhood kids what real fighting looked like. He ended up on his knees, unable to breathe, begging for mercy, and receiving something far more valuable than victory. He received knowledge, humility, and the beginning of wisdom. 5 seconds of violence that led to years of growth. 5 seconds of defeat that proved more educational than 10 years of victories. 5 seconds that showed that sometimes the most important lesson is the one that shatters your certainty and forces you to rebuild your understanding from the ground up. And in the end, Jimmy the Fist Callahan became a better fighter and a better man, not because he won every street fight, but because he lost one gym fight to someone who understood that real mastery wasn't about winning. It was about continuous evolution, constant learning, and the humility to accept that no matter how much you know, there's always more to discover.